He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. A previous leader of ours once said climate change was this generation's nuclear-free moment. I will never stop talking about it, Jacinda Ardern said when she was going for the top job in the 2017 election campaign. Well, these days, she's overseas, and there's a new political climate under a different government that's going for growth. And leaders, past and present, don't seem to talk about climate change nearly so much. And these days, the media, of course, has its own existential crisis going on. So in this climate, has climate change slipped down the media's agenda too? Well, that was part of a debate in Auckland this week. Hayden Donnell was there, and we'll hear from him and others about that later in this program. But first...
So, should Run It Straight be banned, or is it just another sport? Players stand either end of a 20-metre by 4-metre field and run full speed at each other with no protective gear and try to pull the other down. A 19-year-old from New Zealand died on Monday after he got a head injury from playing.
Politics, the wars in the world and the economy all got pushed off the top of the news agenda earlier this week by the death in Palmerston North that ended up being reported all around the world.
Now, 90 seconds to give us your take on Run It Straight. I've heard various versions of, if you try and ban it, it'll just happen anyway. It's just the next step in sort of extreme sports.
Yeah.
What do you make of it?
Interesting. Is it a sport or a rort? I mean, it's barely a sport, is it? It's kind of the rough and tumble of rugby and league, the smashed and bro kind of moment, encapsulated it into an event. But it has a massive following, clearly.
That was Catherine Ryan on her weekly sports chat on 9 to noon last Tuesday, talking to Stuff senior sports journalist Mark Hinton. And many would have shared his view about the Smash and Bro Bull Rush 2.0 collision contest for cash called Run It Straight, that it really wasn't sport at all. And in the remaining seconds before RNZ's midday news, Mark Hinton went on to conclude it was actually entertainment that attracted non-sports people under the influence of online social media influencers, which is a bad thing.
Maybe interest and social media numbers need to take a back seat to what's best for people taking part, and it's not to have your head smashed on a regular basis.
Well, as we've heard a lot on Mediawatch in recent times, social media doesn't seem to have much interest in stuff that's broadly considered not good, but not actually illegal. And just minutes after Catherine Ryan and Mark Hinton closed 9 to noon with that, this broke on Midday Report.
Haere Akine, a 19-year-old, has died after he was critically injured playing a game based on the controversial Run It craze with his friends in Palmerston North.
Later on, the reaction to that led the 6pm TV news for TVNZ.
Don't do it. That's the strong message from a school principal, police and brain experts tonight after a 19-year-old died playing a tackle game based on a social media trend.
And it was the same story leading the news for 3 News.
No mai haere mai, welcome to 3 News. It's time to stop this now. That's the call from a head injury expert after 19-year-old Ryan Satterthwaite died.
And the next morning, the same story told a similar way in the Herald's new streaming show, Herald Now.
Please don't do it. That's the message from the devastated family of Ryan Satterthwaite.
And the notion that all this was really an accident that was waiting to happen had flavoured the coverage, as 3 News went on to point out on Tuesday.
When 3 News spoke to Patria last week, she warned someone would die taking part in these kinds of clashes.
It is very clear from the number of concussions, from the small number of running at each other events that have occurred, that this is going to result in a death.
Patria Hume, biomechanics expert from the Auckland University of Technology, had said that on 3 News a full week earlier, before the first official Run It Straight contests here, which were endorsed by some well-known rugby and league players. The local Democracy Reporting Service reporter, Mary Afamata, described fans queuing up at a sneaker store in Sylvia Park to meet the Run It Straight crew and pick up vouchers and giveaways. And the Run It Straight chief executive, Christian Lesser, told her that giving back to the people was the goal. But concerns among the community board in Manukau were reported by the local Democracy reporter there last week as well. And in far-off Christchurch, The Star ran that story under the headline, "Is this the dumbest sport ever?" And when 2 guys were knocked out in the first official contests held in West Auckland, one of whom appeared to be having seizures after he hit the deck, it was bound to make more headlines. But in spite of the criticism and concern last week, the organisers were still bullish about running a third Run It Straight Champions event, featuring the winners from the first two competing for $250,000. But at that time, the Run It Straight organisers weren't all that keen on questions about health and safety, and even the possibility of a fatality, at least not on News Talk ZB's drive show.
7.5 minutes ago or thereabouts, I just said, no, we don't want to talk to you anymore, so that's fine. Speak instead to CEO of Headway, Stacey Mowbray. Headway's a concussion.
Now, last Tuesday, after the death of Ryan Satterthwaite in Palmerston North, Lisa Owen was telling RNZ's Checkpoint listeners this.
Now to some breaking news. One of the 32 fighters involved in a controversial and unregulated backyard fight contest at the weekend has been referred to the police. The man, whom Checkpoint understands to be a senior mongrel mob member from the Bay of Plenty, was wearing an electronic monitoring bracelet in footage of his fight released to social media and was supposed to be attending a rehabilitation program.
Sounds like that guy's in trouble, and while this was in no way a sanctioned or authorised public event, there were similarities with Run It Straight, cash prizes, social media postings, and other well-known athletes endorsing it.
It was billed as 32 fighters going head-to-head in 1-minute scraps to be the last man standing and crowned King of the Streets.
Now, that was just before 5 p.m. on RNZ National on Tuesday, and just after 5, the police minister was on Checkpoint.
These guys are grown men, and there should be some personal responsibility. You know, I'm seeking advice from Sport NZ in terms of what needs to do or what we should do. But at the end of the day, these guys should be making good decisions themselves.
But if you're a handy fighter who's in need of a bit of cash, well, the good decision might be to give it a crack. And Sport New Zealand's advice to the minister is not really likely to change that. Mark Mitchell also told Lisa Owen that he was also getting advice on the death of Ryan Satterthwaite.
It's awful what's happened, without a doubt. And again, you know, I'm seeking advice from Sport NZ in terms of how we deal with that, because it is unregulated. And I need to understand what powers we've got or what action we can take.
Now, on News Talk ZB's Wellington Morning Show on Wednesday morning, the Prime Minister echoed his police minister on who really needs to be responsible.
Sports influencers and celebrity influencers or whatever it is that's sort of driving this craze. That actually, they should be thinking and reflecting very strongly about it now. But it's not something you can practically ban at a government level, but it's just calling for people to exercise individual responsibility.
Well, there may be legal fishhooks in banning commercial operations like Run It Straight, where people can get hurt, or, as the experts say, inevitably will, or worse. But other things where the potential harm is pretty clear do have clear sanctions too, and there have been plenty of examples in the news lately. Just 2 weeks ago, the government, in its own words, turned up the heat on boy racers and fleeing drivers with what they called a suite of stronger measures to deter antisocial and intimidating driving. And the police minister himself said this at that time.
Antisocial road use and illegal street racing have no place in New Zealand. Our message is clear. If you want to drive dangerously, face the consequences.
Just last Monday, the online influencer Millie Elder Holmes was fined $5,000 for promoting online gambling, part of a recent crackdown by the Department of Internal Affairs on social media influencers. And on Wednesday, a former doctor and TVNZ health show contributor Samantha Bailey was sanctioned by the Health Practitioners Disciplinary Tribunal. It had already cancelled her registration and charged her $148,000 in fines and costs over misinformation in her weekly videos about the COVID-19 vaccine. And at this week's hearing, lawyers for the Medical Council said that in videos that had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times, Bailey had claimed HIV doesn't exist and gonorrhea isn't sexually transmitted. This had the potential to undermine public confidence in established science, said the tribunal, and it could also, of course, make some people very ill if they believed what she'd had to say. And if you're influenced by online hype to run it straight for money and or glory, well, the same thing applies. And there is, of course, also an avenue of appeal. Last year, the government decreed that greyhound racing in New Zealand should be banned from July next year. This week, Greyhound Racing New Zealand applied to the High Court for a judicial review. And unlike the Run It Straight backers, they fronted up to questions from the media. Now, in the end, they may get their day in court about the axing of their sport on the grounds of greyhound welfare. But the prospect of fatal head injuries, it seems, is not enough to prevent collision competitions like Run It Straight from being banned. Auckland's Trust Arena said it won't host the event due to what they called overwhelming concern that the trials have caused, and the general manager told the media this.
Following the trials, it was clear from commentary that there was overwhelming concern for the high-risk nature of the event.
And adding to that commentary was Ryan Satterthwaite's uncle Peter, who told Morning Report on Wednesday he wanted the media and influencers and social media to be the solution.
I mean, it's obviously covered on the news, on the TV last night and tonight, but us saying something on social media is not going to make these young people change their minds or think about their actions or anything like that. But if we have some social media influencers, i.e. some All Blacks, some rugby league players, coaches, that sort of thing, that these young people idolise and look up to, maybe that is going to prevent another accident or another tragic accident.
And on Morning Report on Thursday, the Prime Minister said he also wants online influencers to take a responsible lead, and he was still saying it was not an issue for the government or the law.
Is there a piece of legislation or something that we do to stop it? No, that's not practical. But the point is, common sense would say, as an individual, why would you participate? And the second thing is, for adults and influencers that are pushing it, stop, rethink, sort it out.
Well, laws made in haste in response to a single tragedy are usually a bad idea, but the Prime Minister clearly doesn't think legislation is impractical for social media influence. He's proposing a ban for it for under-16s by law, against the wishes of his biggest ally in the coalition, partly prompted by a well-heeled lobby group and partly by similar public angst about the influence of technology. Last Wednesday on Midweek Mediawatch, our weekly catch-up with Emile Donovan on nights on RNZ National, we talked about some pretty rugged radio ratings for RNZ National out this week that showed a further loss of listeners for many programs, but an increase for RNZ Concert, and it followed a big leap in engagement for RNZ's digital stuff. And speaking of digital stuff, the Herald this week launched its brand new streaming 7 to 9 a.m. morning video news show.
It's all of the big news interviews that you need for your day in one place. We're broadcasting live from inside NZME's newsroom, which means all of these people behind me are getting sick of me. I've been doing rehearsals for a week. On the show today, welfare crackdown. New benefit sanctions kick in today. David Seymour is live at the desk, and we've got an advocate joining us for the other side.
We took a look at the first outings of Herald Now in Midweek Mediawatch this week on Nights with Emile Donovan. If you missed it, it's on the Mediawatch podcast page at rnz.co.nz or available for free wherever you get your podcasts. Now, as you heard there, David Seymour was the first politician up on the Herald's new show, and he was also on the front page of this week's Listener, which looked back at the career achievements and influences of Deputy Dave, as the magazine called him, because Mr Seymour becomes Deputy Prime Minister in the governing coalition this week. And David Seymour was also the unwilling subject of a program about his influences, one that he didn't engage with by choice.
I wish you all the best with your taxpayer-funded crackpot documentary. We've seen your questions and I think you're a joke.
You, sir.
Yeah, sorry.
You were the party of democracy. In the spirit of democracy, when am I meant to get a word out to do my job?
Excuse me.
Now, also on Midweek Mediawatch this week, we discussed briefly developments in the bid to reshape the board of the New Zealand Herald's publisher NZME, whose shareholders vote on that next week. And one of those who's been nominated for a proposed new editorial board at NZME is the lawyer Philip Crump, also the former editor of NZME's short-lived subscriber service ZB+. Now, he sparked some debate among journalists recently with a list of 6 ways to improve journalism and trust in the media. And that sparked a critical response from NBR journalist Tim Hunter on social media, who, to paraphrase, thought that the advice was a bit like teaching grandma to suck eggs. And he highlighted Philip Crump's claim that loaded language and descriptive words used by journalists can become cheap shots that erode trust in mastheads over time. He cited the example of embattled to describe a politician, but on Midweek Mediawatch that was misinterpreted during the conversation. So, to correct the record, Philip Crump did not suggest that using the word embattled could erode trust or indicate bias on the part of a journalist. In fact, he'd said that using such a word might legitimately add colour and provide meaningful context. But he believes often these labels are abused and reveal the biases of the journalist deploying them rather than enlightening the reader. In the same Midweek Mediawatch segment, I also identified the NBR's Tim Hunter as the author of the NBR's weekly column Shoeshine, and he used to be, but his own column these days is Hunter's Corner, and it's others at NBR who now fill his shoes on the Shoeshine column each week. After a big week presenting and defending Budget 2025, the Finance Minister Nicola Willis fronted up for a long chat about it with TVNZ's Jack Tame last weekend on the Q&A show, and the interview went on for a whopping 27 minutes, and 24 of those had gone by before Jack Tame asked Nicola Willis this.
Under the Paris Climate Agreement, New Zealand is on the hook for potentially billions of dollars in offshore carbon credits, which Treasury say need to be purchased within the forecast period. Those aren't accounted for anywhere in the budget. Are we still committed to those targets?
Good question. With so much focus on about $13 billion odd in savings from changing pay equity legislation, a potential liability of almost twice as much does seem significant. And the Minister replied that they are still committed to those targets, but...
and because there's not enough clarity yet in how we will meet that commitment, it's not reflected in the books.
So still a big liability in principle, even if it's not on the books at the moment. Now, with time running out on Tame, he left it there to then move on and ask about police funding, but at least he asked. And on Tuesday morning, Morning Report listeners heard that documents released under the Official Information Act said that the government has been warned that a huge shortfall for meeting the country's international targets will be scrutinised overseas, and so will an apparent shortfall in our plans for that.
Now, there was some presumably juicy advice on potential risks to our international relationships. That was all blanked out before we got to see it, but we can see that Minister Watts was told to expect scrutiny from other countries if we handed in our homework and essentially said, sorry, the dog ate some of this.
Eloise Gibson, RNZ's climate change correspondent on Morning Report last Tuesday. Now, 2 days later, Eloise Gibson was at a gathering at the Auckland University of Technology discussing the current state of climate change coverage and its place in news media today. Mediawatch's Hayden Donnell was there too, also pondering the change in the climate for climate change coverage today.
To stay within the Paris Agreement's temperature goals and build a more resilient and thriving future, we need to cut global emissions by 45% below 2010 levels by 2030. Now, so far, the world has committed to only a fraction of what is required. But having delayed action for decades, there is still time. And that's what makes the moment that we find ourselves in now so exciting.
That's former Climate Minister James Shaw talking up the government's commitment to the Paris Agreement back in 2021. The tenor of the political discourse has changed a little since then, with our current ministers slightly less bullish about the imperative to quickly transition to a low-carbon economy.
We're not going to be guilt-tripped by these fanciful accounts that the planet is boiling. We need New Zealand's natural resources.
That was taken from a Facebook post by Minister for Resources Shane Jones, which was appropriately set against a backdrop of clip art flames. Jones is following in the footsteps of politicians overseas who have also come to see action to stave off the most destructive effects of climate change as self-defeating or, even worse, woke. Most prominently, US President Donald Trump has come to office with a catchy mantra. This is from his inauguration.
That is why today I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill.
This is from his State of the Nation speech.
And now, drill, baby, drill.
The media environment has followed the same trajectory to the political one in some respects. Back when James Shaw was issuing those optimistic pronouncements, several of our major media companies were making their own commitments to climate action. Stuff had launched 2 long-term climate coverage projects. Its first, Quick, Save the Planet, morphed into the Forever Project, a section devoted to in-depth climate coverage from science journalists like Eloise Gibson and Olivia Wanan. In both cases, the site's editor Patrick Crudson took a strong editorial stance, assuring audiences they wouldn't give space to so-called climate scepticism or, in his words, debunked denialism. Here's what he had to say to Mediawatch at the time.
We wanted to use our status as the country's biggest homegrown website to just really pound away at climate change coverage on a regular basis, to increase the intensity of it and to make the problems of climate change feel urgent and tangible and unignorable.
The New Zealand Herald and a host of other media organisations got in on the act, signing up to the global Covering Climate Now initiative and putting out their own climate projects. Fast forward to today. The Forever Project still exists, but doesn't have any dedicated reporters. Gibson and Wannon have both left Stuff, the former for RNZ, and the latter to do comms for the Carbon Removal Research Project at the University of Canterbury. Former Herald Science reporter Jamie Morton, who carried out in-depth climate reporting, has left the outlet and is now freelancing. Climate change has dropped down the news agenda, buried beneath waves of stories about COVID and, more recently, the cost of living crisis. Gibson is now the only dedicated climate reporter at a mainstream outlet. All this is to say, this week's Framing the Climate Emergency event at AUT University came at a slightly fraught time. That was reflected in the discussion from its panel of journalists. Newsroom's Mark Dalder, TVNZ Mid-Eye presenter Miriama Kamor, and the aforementioned Gibson, who told this story about getting her hopes up seeing international media outlets covering the Copenhagen Climate Summit, only to later have those hopes dashed upon the harsh rocks of reality.
So they would have 10 people in the media room working in shifts around the clock to break different angles on this crisis, and I was so jealous, and I thought, is New Zealand ever going to do this? Spoiler alert, it really did not.
Why not, though? The panel offered reasons, including the parlous state of the media's finances and climate change being dragged into the culture wars, kicking and screaming. But there were some sunnier moments as well. Kamor in particular talked about the benefits she'd reap from adopting a zero-waste lifestyle, or at least as close to one as she can.
There was so much that was gained from it. And the biggest and most unexpected one was joy. I felt joy in living differently and more lightly and more in tune with the planet. And I met amazing people to whom I'm still connected. That connection was the biggest gain from changing my life. I spent a fair bit of time generating content that I hope inspires people into action as well.
That might not sound like it's related to climate change coverage, but if there was a common thread in the discussion, it was that offering people agency to address climate change, even in small ways, seems to be the best way to make stories about a grinding, slow-moving crisis cut through. Kamor had to take off after the panel ended, but I asked the other two journalists to give their take on the state of climate coverage today and what their hopes are for its future, if any. Kia ora, Eloise and Mark. A few years ago, it felt like climate journalism was on the up. Kind of felt like it was going to get through to prominence. And what happened?
I still think it has more prominence than it had 10 years ago. There is still strong climate journalism at all of our major media outlets, but the surge in specialist climate roles has definitely disappeared. TV3 not only no longer has a climate journalist, but no longer exists in its news form. TVNZ's mooted climate desk did not eventuate and apparently is not likely to. We are even more reliant than ever on the likes of market outlets like Newsroom and the spin-off to supplement what our mainstream media is able to do. There is the likes of Liz at Carbon News. There are those specialist climate publications, but in mainstream news outlets, the RNZs, the TVNZs, I believe that my job is the only one.
The media sector has gone the way it has, and that hasn't helped. But also we've seen, particularly in the last couple of years, it feels like a little bit of a retreating on climate issues at the corporate level, at the government level as well. And so it feels like there's, some connection between those things. The amount of attention that it's given is decreasing.
Yes, has climate change been caught up in a political reactionary movement? Now you do have a lot of governments around the world that have been reactionary against what was perceived as like a woke ideology that was dominant at some point. Has climate change coverage been caught up in that?
Politically, I think climate change has always been a lot more politicised and partisan than it should have been. I mean, it's a scientific fact and it's in everybody's interests to address it, yet it did become a left-right debate for a while. I think, though, a lot of countries have moved past that and actually have stayed past that in the Trump era. So Trump's election has had a huge impact on climate politics around the world, but it hasn't seen a mass retreat from the Paris climate change agreement, and in fact has indirectly, arguably assisted the election of much more climate-forward governments in the likes of Australia and Canada in a backlash to Trump-style politics. So I don't think it's been a clean moving away, but I would say that the world is very distracted right now.
But I wonder about it just because it's become such a partisan and politicised issue, newsrooms are now more wary of just covering it in the way that the Forever Project might have, or just strongly advocating for climate action because they know that that will alienate some people or cause some trouble. Is that a factor?
I don't think it's more politicised than it was. The media has been trying a bunch of stuff in a bid to stay commercial and stay afloat. Sometimes when climate change initiatives have been tried, it's kind of been as a, let's throw this at the wall and see what happens. I mean, certainly something like the Forever Project was set up with an advocacy agenda to an extent. It was set up to tell stories about the climate crisis and stated right at the outset that it wasn't going to include climate denial in its coverage. But I would argue that that line in the sand was not super far ahead of actually where the rest of the media is, and that if you don't call it that, you don't put a special label on it, the media is still a lot further along than it was, 10 years ago.
I would always respectfully disagree, Eloise. So I think the way that the media has covered climate change and the changes there are mostly commercially related decisions. The way that politicians talk about climate change now is measurably different from 5 or 6 years ago. You had Winston Peters last year basically saying he didn't believe NIWA's figures on carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, but those are like the very fundamental basic numbers that underpin our understanding of and certainty about climate change in terms of the degree to which humans have contributed to that.
And does that mean that in your experience, or do you think you're in the press gallery, are some editors, journalists then reluctant to make definitive statements about climate change because they would be seen as making a politicised statement that goes against some of the prevailing views in the government, for instance?
I haven't experienced that myself. I don't know that that's what's happening in the gallery. I think people might not be covering the kind of government and business retreat on climate issues as a retreat or as substantively as maybe they should, as compared to viewing it within that culture war lens. And when you get into the culture wars, it is hard because people don't want to be seen to be taking sides in that when they're doing their reporting. But then you do have things like, these very basic facts. Even Winston Peters, was on record in 2018 basically saying that's rubbish to someone who put to him the exact same thing he later put out in Parliament and in the Pacific last year. And so it feels like the Overton window maybe has shifted a bit on some of this stuff.
I don't think you can separate covering climate change from politics because policy and economic decisions are intrinsically tied up in climate change action, particularly now that 90% of the country accepts that it's a problem and wants the government to do something about it, and the question becomes how. You can't not tackle politics as that, but that's not the same as being partisan. I would agree with Mark, though, and I perhaps should have said that while Trump hasn't pulled other major trading partners backwards on climate change, New Zealand is talking the talk further back on climate change than at any time since I've been a climate change journalist under parties of either persuasion. But I personally don't see that changing the way that the media reports it. I think you do see Christopher Luxon and senior ministers being held to account increasingly for their decisions on climate change. Forums, it's just that they seem to be banking on there being no consequences for not having an answer to that at the moment.
I do bemoan the cultural warification of so many different things. Journalists are still very adept at covering the substance of the issues that have been had culture wars applied to them, but when they're covering the statements of politicians, it gets really difficult. I don't think media have figured out how to say while maintaining...
Without sounding politically biased, that a politician is wrong.
Yeah, and while maintaining the trust of our audience.
RNZ has run fact checks of Winston Peters' statement on the Paris Agreement this year and has just laid out why those statements were incorrect. So I don't think it precludes even mainstream media outlets from stating facts and giving context when that is required to inform our audience, particularly if, in this case, we were the ones that broadcast the statements in the first place. I think it's actually beholden on us to give the whole picture. And I don't actually think that's a partisan or political thing to do. It's just doing your job, right? But there is always...
But you know that you will be accused then of being biased media, and there will be consequences that come with that in terms of, even if it's just online abuse.
There's always online abuse, and there is a very angry group of people out there, but they're not the majority, and I don't think you can tailor your reporting to what a small group of people are going to say. You need to tailor your reporting to what you know to be accurate, to what you know most people in New Zealand want to know. They just want to know as close as you can get to the facts. And it's not always going to be perfect, but you should be striving for that, I think, regardless of angry online comments or whatever coming your way.
To what extent do you think that the reduction in specialist climate reporting is just down to the financial situation of our media outlets? Maybe when the Forever Project was going on, they were really making a play for subscribers. They were trying to say we're doing really worthy reporting on an important issue. Maybe now we've gone back to a clicks model. We're just kind of flailing around looking for stuff that keeps us afloat.
I think largely commercial. I don't think that editors and newsroom leaders are making these decisions on the basis of, well, the government is doing less climate policy, so we're going to do less climate reporting. It really is a reflection of the commercial kind of struggles of the media sector, but it coincides with this backtracking on government and business.
Interestingly, when Stuff launched the Forever Project, it did have a large number of sponsors, but it was also a play for trust. That was when Stuff was very big, and not to imply they're not now, but they were making a real push to build trust, and RNZ is making a real push to build trust now. Straight down the line, calm, accurate reporting on climate change does seem to build trust. We get a lot of emails about that saying, I really appreciated the way you explained that just now. I didn't feel like you were pushing a particular line, you were just telling me what you know, and that was great. We get the angry ones as well. But I think it's important not just for commercial reasons. It's important because it's like a hygiene factor. It's like not covering the economy. And so even though journalism is shrinking and journalism is struggling to fund itself, it is still a choice to what extent you prioritise it. And, as I said on the panel just now, we always can find money for people to write about sport. That's a choice.
So you think our news organisations have made mistakes, really?
You say make mistakes. I think the media is getting better. I think we're compromising the ability of young journalists to stay in the industry.
Yeah, I like right now, like we've said, in mainstream media, there's just one person who has a full-time job covering climate, and that's Eloise, right? And I, on a good month, spend about half my time covering climate. I don't know where it's going to go, but the current trend is downwards. It's away. Something somewhere needs to change to enable that growth in the climate coverage.
What needs to change?
One part of me says, newsroom leaders need to take more risks, do the Forever Project type thing again. But also, they tried that and it maybe didn't work, right? You can't just make people eat their vegetables on the internet. If they don't want to read an article about climate change, they're just going to go onto TikTok instead. And so how do you convince people that this is something that they do want to be engaging with?
And Eloise, you talked about just to do that, you have to make climate coverage apply to people's day-to-day lives, their immediate concerns, because that's what always comes up as number one when you ask people what they're concerned about, the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, and it's not that they're not concerned about climate change. They have got immediate and pressing concerns that are pushing that out of their mind, and they don't have the bandwidth. And it's so obvious now that those two things are compatible and connected, so you don't have to make it relevant. It is relevant. Gas prices are going up. Gas supplies are dwindling. There are all kinds of things happening in our transport system, in our energy security, in the price of solar panels and batteries that are so relevant to people's lives and to the things that they value. And it is a matter of, I think, trying to bring those two things together.
You said something interesting in the panel, Eloise, which is that you like to take politicians at their word when they say that they're going to honour the Paris Agreement, they're going to reduce emissions by such and such a percent.
A tactic that I'm increasingly using is to take politicians' assertions that they will meet our Paris target and they do think climate change is real, as if they meant it. They said it in public, they said it during the election campaign. If we take that as real, what choices and trade-offs do we need to make that happen?
Is that a failure of the media to hold them to account for those statements?
I think one part of it is the long-term nature of this. That's lessening now as we get closer to 2030, which is the deadline for our Paris target. But it was set by the key government in 2015. Barring some political miracles, the Prime Minister, when it actually came time to pay that debt. And that's been the case for, government after government for many, many years, is that they're making decisions, but they know they're not going to be the ones who actually have to implement them. That's beginning to change because we have the Zero Carbon Act and this legal framework and architecture, these targets and budgets that are legally binding, that ratchet down every 5 years. 5 years is a long time in politics. How many different party leaders have we had in the major parties over?
When it comes to accountability and holding politicians to account, the cost of doing the thing today is very obvious and visible. The cost of carbon, what economists like to call the social cost of carbon, is a lot less visible. But it's also both the media and politicians to reacting to what they think people want, how they think people think. And so maybe it turns out you can get re-elected after completely failing on your climate promises.
Another question being, to what degree are people actually as concerned about these issues as the media coverage lambasting the politicians might suggest, right?
There was an idea for a while that subscribers were going to save climate journalism. You created a really good quality product that people would come to and they would donate and they would subscribe, and we would go back to people paying for more of their news rather than this free clickbait model. And that has worked in the sense that both Newsroom and the spin-off are still going, which is super impressive in the environment that we're in. But there was also this idea that, people will pay for really good climate journalism, so we can have paid newsletters and we can have all of these things that keep this ecosystem going. Not only did I not really see that materialise, although there are some very good podcasts and newsletters out there paid for by subscribers, but I'm not sure that fulfills the media's mandate to keep the general public informed.
You mentioned, Mark, finally, in the panel, there's all these debates about whether to motivate people on climate change you need to use hope or fear, and you've said that that's wrong, that actually you need to give people agency. So maybe just lastly, what agency would you give people if they do want to save climate reporting, if they want to see more of it?
Supporting news outlets that do it and telling them that that's why you're supporting them as well. We get lots of metrics about how many people click on things and so on and so forth, but it's different hearing from readers themselves, I think. But really that key bit is the financial support, because again, that's just the problem. And so if you want a New Zealand journalist to tell you what the climate change minister is doing for 2 weeks over in Brazil with all the other world leaders, someone needs to pay for that.
Yeah, we have seen from the United States, the Washington Post and others, that a model where a benevolent billionaire comes along and hands you a bunch of money to cover your journalism is not the saving grace that you would hope for. It then compromises you in all kinds of ways. So if people want their media to be truly independent and truly able to freely do their jobs, it does require support. In RNZ's case, just listening and clicking and getting involved and sharing the stories.
Hayden Donnell there talking to Mark Dalder, a senior political reporter at Newsroom who covers climate change as well as health, energy and extremism. And he also spoke to RNZ's climate change correspondent Eloise Gibson at Framing the Emergency, a symposium on climate journalism held last Thursday at the Auckland University of Technology. That's it for this weekend. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Hayden Donnell for producing and reporting back from this week's Climate Change Journalism Summit at the AUT. And Hayden will be back next week with Midweek Mediawatch. If you have any thoughts for us or ideas for us to follow up, do get in touch. Email us at mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediawatchNZ on X. And you can even write us a letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123, Wellington. Hayden will be back next Wednesday with Midweek Mediawatch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Mediawatch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.